The morning fog still clung to the weathered brick buildings of Ballard when the black SUVs rolled down Northwest Market Street like a funeral procession. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November 2023, and the neighborhood's routine was about to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, 73 years old and a creature of habit, had been walking her arthritic golden retriever past Nordic Grounds coffee shop for the better part of 8 years. She knew the sound of David Wagner's keys jingling against the glass door, the familiar screech of the metal security gate being rolled up, the warm amber glow that would soon spill onto the sidewalk like a beacon of comfort in the Pacific Northwest gloom. But this morning, instead of Wagner's gentle smile and his customary wave through the window, Eleanor watched as federal agents in tactical gear surrounded the man she had trusted with her grandson's first job application. The same hands that had carefully steamed her oat milk latte every morning were now being forced behind his back, steel handcuffs clicking into place with a sound that seemed to echo off every storefront on the block. Wagner's face, usually animated with the easy charm that had made Nordic Grounds the heart of this tight-knit community, had drained of all color. His eyes, those same warm brown eyes that had consoled her when her husband passed 2 winters ago, now darted frantically between the growing crowd of neighbors, emerging from their morning routines like sleepwalkers stumbling into a nightmare. The FBI's Seattle field office had been planning this arrest for weeks, but nothing could have prepared the Ballard community for the accusation that would follow. As Agent Sarah McNeil read the charges in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent street, the words seemed to hang in the cold air like toxic smoke. Murder in the first degree, aggravated sexual assault, unlawful imprisonment. The victim's name cut through the morning stillness with surgical precision. Rachel Marie Thompson, 21 years old, University of Washington student, found dead in her Capitol Hill apartment on April 15, 2020. Eleanor's legs gave out. The coffee shop owner, who had donated dozens of Thanksgiving meals to the Ballard Food Bank, who had stayed open during the worst of the pandemic to serve essential workers for free, who had coached her grandson's Little League team to 3 consecutive championships, was being accused of the most heinous crime imaginable. The man who knew every regular customer's order by heart, who remembered birthdays and asked about sick relatives, who had transformed a struggling corner business into the neighborhood's unofficial community center, was allegedly a killer. As the SUVs pulled away with Wagner secured in the back seat, the gathered crowd stood in stunned silence. The familiar aroma of freshly ground coffee beans still lingered from the shop's interior, where tomorrow's pastries sat waiting in the walk-in cooler, where the espresso machine Wagner had personally restored would never again hiss to life under his careful hands. Nordic Grounds would remain closed indefinitely, its windows reflecting the disbelieving faces of a community forced to confront a terrible truth. They had welcomed a monster into their daily lives, bought coffee from hands that had taken an innocent life, and trusted their children with a man whose secrets were darker than the strongest roast in his carefully curated collection. April 15, 2020, had begun like every other day during Seattle's first pandemic lockdown, with the kind of oppressive silence that had settled over Capitol Hill like a heavy blanket. The streets that once thrummed with the energy of college students, street musicians, and late-night revelers now stretched empty under the pale spring sky. Rachel Marie Thompson's third-floor apartment at 1247 East Pine Street sat wedged between a shuttered vintage clothing store and a Thai restaurant that had pivoted to delivery-only service, its neon signs dark for the first time in 15 years. Rachel had adapted to isolation better than most of her University of Washington classmates. The psychology major from Spokane had always been introspective, finding solace in her textbooks and the small rituals that structured her days during the university's abrupt transition to remote learning. Her apartment, a modest one-bedroom with exposed brick walls and windows that caught the afternoon light, had become both sanctuary and prison. The neighbors in the adjacent units had grown accustomed to the soft sounds of her daily routine. The gentle hum of her laptop during virtual lectures, the quiet footsteps across hardwood floors during her afternoon yoga sessions, the low murmur of phone calls with her parents back home. But on that Wednesday evening, the building's familiar acoustic landscape changed. Mrs. Yang, the elderly tenant directly below Rachel's unit, later told investigators that she heard furniture moving around 9:30 p.m., followed by what sounded like muffled voices. She had assumed Rachel was rearranging her study space, a common occurrence since the lockdown began. The sounds escalated into what Yang described as a struggle, but the thin walls of the converted 1920s apartment building carried noise from all directions, and she hesitated to call police during a time when 911 services were overwhelmed with pandemic-related emergencies. By 11:15 p.m., the building had fallen into its usual quiet. It wasn't until Thursday afternoon, when Rachel failed to appear for her virtual abnormal psychology seminar, that her absence triggered concern. Professor Margaret Liu, who had taught Rachel for 3 semesters and recognized her as one of her most dedicated students, attempted multiple calls and emails before finally contacting the building's property manager. Rachel's parents, David and Susan Thompson, had been expecting their daughter's weekly check-in call and grew frantic when she didn't respond to increasingly desperate messages. The discovery came at 6:42 p.m. on Thursday, April 16th. Building Superintendent Ramon Valdez used his master key to enter the apartment after obtaining permission from concerned family members. The scene that greeted him would haunt his dreams for years to come. Rachel's lifeless body lay near the overturned coffee table in her living room, her laptop still open to the virtual classroom she would never return to. The medical examiner would later determine that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. But the apartment showed signs of a prolonged struggle. Furniture had been displaced, her bookshelf emptied onto the floor, and personal items scattered throughout the room as if someone had been searching for something specific. Seattle Police Detective Maria Santos arrived on scene within 40 minutes, but the investigation was immediately hampered by the chaos of early pandemic protocols. Evidence collection procedures had been modified, staffing was reduced, and the usual network of witness interviews was complicated by lockdown restrictions. The case file would eventually grow thick with forensic reports, crime scene photographs, and witness statements. But in those crucial first hours, as the city struggled to balance public safety with public health, Rachel Thompson's murder began its tragic journey toward becoming just another cold case in an overwhelmed system's expanding pile of unsolved mysteries. The revelation that Rachel Thompson had been a regular customer at Nordic grounds sent shockwaves through the Ballard community that extended far beyond the initial arrest. As Seattle police detectives began conducting door-to-door interviews in the weeks following Wagner's arrest, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the testimonies of neighbors who had considered the coffee shop owner a pillar of their tight-knit community. Lisa Henderson, a freelance graphic designer who had frequented Nordic grounds for her morning cappuccino since 2018, was among the first to speak with investigators. Her hands trembled as she described how Wagner had always seemed to pay special attention to young women, particularly college-age customers who visited the shop alone. Henderson recounted how Wagner would linger at tables occupied by university students, refilling their cups without being asked, engaging them in conversations that seemed to stretch longer than necessary. At the time, she had interpreted his behavior as exceptional customer service, the kind of personal touch that made Nordic grounds feel more like a living room than a commercial establishment. But viewed through the lens of the murder charges, these interactions took on a sinister quality that made her stomach turn. She remembered how Wagner would ask probing questions about class schedules, living arrangements, and whether the young women lived alone. He had a remarkable memory for personal details, remembering not just coffee preferences, but also exam dates, work schedules, and family situations that customers had mentioned in passing. The detective assigned to neighborhood canvassing.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Sergeant Michael Reeves discovered that Wagner had maintained what he called a customer preference book behind the counter, a leather-bound journal where he meticulously recorded not just drink orders, but personal information about regular patrons. When the journal was seized as evidence, investigators found detailed entries about dozens of young women, including their addresses, phone numbers gleaned from overheard conversations, and notes about their daily routines. Rachel Thompson's entry was among the most extensive, spanning nearly 2 full pages, with observations about her study habits, her part-time job at a campus bookstore, and even speculation about her relationship status. Margaret Foster, a 67-year-old retired teacher who lived 2 blocks from the coffee shop, provided perhaps the most chilling testimony. She had witnessed Wagner on multiple occasions, standing outside his shop during closing time, watching young women walk to their cars or toward the bus stop. When questioned about this behavior, Foster initially defended Wagner, explaining that she had assumed he was simply being protective of customers' safety in an urban environment. But as she spoke with Detective Reeves, her certainty began to waver. She recalled seeing Wagner's distinctive burgundy Honda Civic parked in locations throughout Ballard, where it didn't belong, always in spots with clear sightlines to apartment buildings or student housing complexes. The most disturbing revelation came from Jennifer Walsh, a barista who had worked at Nordic grounds for 8 months before quitting abruptly in March 2020. Walsh had never reported Wagner's behavior to authorities, attributing her discomfort to workplace anxiety rather than recognizing the warning signs of predatory conduct. She described how Wagner would require her to clean the storage room alone while he handled the front counter, but would frequently interrupt her work with unnecessary visits to the back area. He had installed a security camera system that seemed focused more on employee monitoring than customer safety, with angles that captured the employee break room and even the single-occupancy restroom. Walsh's testimony revealed that Wagner had become increasingly agitated during the early weeks of the pandemic lockdown, expressing frustration about the loss of his regular customer interactions. He had begun taking unauthorized breaks from the shop, claiming he needed to check on elderly customers who hadn't been seen recently. But Walsh noticed that his concern seemed exclusively focused on young women, and he would return from these welfare checks with detailed reports about their living situations and daily routines that seemed far too comprehensive for casual check-ins. The barista had quit via text message after Wagner suggested she accompany him on one of these visits, claiming it would help build customer relationships that would be valuable when the pandemic ended. The breakthrough that would ultimately unravel David Wagner's carefully constructed facade came not from traditional detective work, but from the relentless advance of forensic technology that had transformed criminal investigation in the 3 years since Rachel Thompson's murder. Dr. Amanda Stevens, the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory's lead forensic geneticist, had been working on a backlog of cold cases when she received approval to apply genetic genealogy techniques to the biological evidence recovered from beneath Rachel's fingernails. The DNA sample had been too degraded and mixed for traditional CODIS database comparison, but advances in SNP analysis and genealogical database cross-referencing had opened new possibilities that didn't exist in 2020. The process began in September 2023, when Dr. Stevens uploaded the genetic profile to GED Match, Family Tree DNA, and other genealogical databases that allow law enforcement access. The initial results yielded dozens of potential familial connections, distant cousins and relatives spread across the Pacific Northwest, whose DNA shared common markers with the unknown perpetrator. The painstaking work of building family trees and eliminating suspects required collaboration between the crime lab, Seattle PD's cold case unit, and professional genealogists who specialized in forensic applications. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Yang, who had inherited the Thompson case when she was promoted to head the cold case division, spent weeks following digital paper trails that led through marriage records, birth certificates, and immigration documents dating back to the early 1900s. The investigation revealed that the DNA belonged to someone descended from German immigrants who had settled in the Puget Sound region in the 1920s, a genealogical pathway that eventually pointed to 3 possible family lines. Each branch required extensive investigation, with detectives tracking down living relatives and building comprehensive family trees that could either include or exclude potential suspects. The breakthrough moment came on October 23, 2023, when the genealogical research identified David Wagner as a person of interest. His paternal grandmother, Ingrid Wagner, had been among the German immigrants whose descendants matched the DNA profile, and public records showed that David had been born and raised in the Seattle area. Detective Yang's team began the delicate process of obtaining a comparison sample without alerting Wagner to their suspicions. They collected a discarded coffee cup from Nordic grounds, carefully preserved the saliva residue from the rim, and submitted it for laboratory analysis. Dr. Stevens processed the comparison sample using the most advanced forensic techniques available, employing STR analysis, mitochondrial DNA testing, and Y chromosome markers to build a comprehensive genetic profile. The results, confirmed through multiple independent tests to eliminate any possibility of contamination or error, showed a perfect match to the DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene. The statistical probability of the match occurring by chance was calculated at 1 in 47 billion, a figure that would prove crucial when prosecutors eventually presented their case. The confirmation of Wagner's DNA at the crime scene triggered an immediate escalation in the investigation. Seattle PD obtained surveillance warrants for Wagner's digital communications, financial records, and movement patterns dating back to 2020. Cell tower data from April 15th placed Wagner's phone in the Capitol Hill area during the estimated time of Rachel's murder, contradicting his eventual alibi claim of working late inventory at the coffee shop. Credit card records showed purchases at a hardware store just 2 days before the murder, including items that could have been used to gain entry to an apartment building. Detective Yang coordinated with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to develop a psychological profile that would guide the interrogation strategy. The profile suggested that Wagner was likely a methodical offender who had been escalating his predatory behavior over time, using his position as a trusted community figure to identify and target vulnerable victims. The recommendation was to arrest Wagner quickly before he could destroy evidence or potentially harm other victims, leading to the coordinated dawn raid that would finally bring the Ballard community face to face with the monster who had been hiding in plain sight among them for years. The digital forensics investigation into David Wagner's electronic devices revealed a web of surveillance and predatory behavior that extended far beyond what investigators had initially suspected. When FBI cybercrime specialists executed their search warrant on Nordic grounds in late November 2023, they discovered that Wagner had transformed his coffee shop into a sophisticated surveillance operation disguised as a neighborhood gathering place. The shop's Wi-Fi network, advertised to customers as complimentary internet access, had been configured with custom firmware that allowed Wagner to monitor every device that connected to his system, capturing browsing histories, social media activity, and even personal communications from unsuspecting patrons. Digital forensics expert Marcus Rivera spent weeks analyzing the seized equipment, uncovering a deliberately concealed secondary server housed in the coffee shop's basement storage area. The server contained terabytes of data harvested from customer devices over a period of nearly 4 years, with particular emphasis on young women's social media profiles, dating app conversations, and location tracking information. Wagner had written custom scripts to automatically capture photographs posted to Instagram and Facebook, creating extensive digital dossiers on dozens of University of Washington students who had unknowingly exposed their personal lives while enjoying their daily coffee routine. The investigation revealed that Wagner had been using advanced social media monitoring tools typically employed by marketing companies to track his targets across multiple platforms. He maintained detailed spreadsheets documenting class schedules extracted from university portal logins, work schedules determined through social media check-ins, and living arrangements pieced together from tagged locations and friend interactions. Rachel Thompson's digital profile was among the most comprehensive, spanning 18 months of surveillance that documented her daily routines with disturbing precision. Security camera footage from businesses throughout the Capitol Hill and University District areas provided visual confirmation of Wagner's stalking behavior. Traffic cameras, ATM surveillance systems, and storefront security recordings showed Wagner's distinctive burgundy Honda Civic following Rachel's route from the Ballard coffee shop to her Capitol Hill apartment on at least 7 documented occasions between January and April 2020. The footage revealed a pattern of calculated surveillance, with Wagner maintaining careful distances and using parking structures and side streets to avoid detection while tracking Rachel's movements. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Wagner's research methodology, documented in encrypted files on his personal laptop. He had developed what he termed customer relationship profiles that combined digital surveillance with physical observation to create comprehensive behavioral maps of his targets. The files contained detailed notes about Rachel's study habits, her preference for studying alone in quiet corners of coffee shops, her tendency to walk home after dark rather than taking rideshare services, and her apparent lack of a steady romantic relationship based on her social media activity. The digital evidence also revealed Wagner's escalating frustration with pandemic lockdown measures that had disrupted his surveillance routine. Encrypted chat logs on his devices showed communications with dark web forums where he discussed techniques for gaining unauthorized access to apartment buildings, methods for bypassing door locks, and strategies for avoiding security cameras during nighttime activities. The posts, written under pseudonyms but traced back to Wagner's IP address through digital forensic analysis, demonstrated a clear progression from fantasy to planning to action in the weeks leading up to Rachel's murder. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Patricia Coleman reviewed the digital evidence and concluded that Wagner exhibited classic patterns of predatory escalation, using his position as a trusted community figure to normalize his intrusive behavior while building detailed intelligence about potential victims. His coffee shop provided the perfect cover for his activities, allowing him to interact with targets in a seemingly innocent environment, while gathering the information he needed to track and eventually victimize them. The digital forensics evidence painted a picture of a methodical predator who had been operating undetected in plain sight, using technology and social engineering to identify vulnerable targets within the very community that trusted and supported him. The mountain of circumstantial evidence against David Wagner began to take on the weight of an avalanche as investigators pieced together his movements and communications from April 2020. Cell tower triangulation data, obtained through court-ordered warrants, placed Wagner's mobile device in the immediate vicinity of Rachel Thompson's Capitol Hill apartment building on the night of April 15th, contradicting the alibi he would later provide to investigators. The digital trail showed his phone pinging towers along the route from Ballard to Capitol Hill at 8:47 p.m., remaining in the area until approximately 11:23 p.m., then returning to the Ballard neighborhood, where it remained stationary until the following morning. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Yang meticulously reconstructed Wagner's claimed whereabouts on the night of the murder, following up on his assertion that he had been conducting inventory work at Nordic grounds until late in the evening. Security footage from neighboring businesses told a different story entirely. The vintage bookstore next door to the coffee shop had motion-activated cameras that captured the shop's front entrance, showing Wagner leaving the premises at 8:15 p.m. and not returning until after midnight. The time-stamped footage directly contradicted his sworn statement to investigators, creating the first major crack in his defense. Financial records provided additional evidence of Wagner's deception. His business credit card showed no transactions on April 15th that would support his inventory alibi, but did show suspicious purchases in the days leading up to Rachel's murder. On April 13th, he had visited a Harbor Freight Tools location in Ballard, purchasing a small crowbar, work gloves, and a tactical flashlight. Security footage from the store showed Wagner paying in cash for these items, despite typically using his business credit card for all shop-related purchases, suggesting a deliberate attempt to avoid creating a digital paper trail. The investigation also revealed Wagner's pattern of deceptive behavior in the immediate aftermath of Rachel's murder. Phone records showed that he had made several calls to his coffee shop's landline from various locations around the city on April 16th, apparently creating fake alibi evidence by leaving himself voicemail messages about inventory discrepancies that needed to be resolved. The messages, time-stamped throughout the day, were designed to support his claim of discovering problems with his inventory count that required immediate attention, providing a retroactive justification for his extended absence from the shop. Perhaps most damaging was the forensic analysis of Wagner's vehicle, which had been impounded immediately following his arrest. Despite the 3-year gap since the crime, advanced luminol testing revealed traces of blood evidence in the Honda Civic's trunk area that proved to be a DNA match for Rachel Thompson. Fiber analysis also recovered threads from the trunk carpeting that matched fabric from the sweatshirt Rachel had been wearing on the night she died. The evidence suggested that Wagner had transported Rachel's body or bloody clothing in his vehicle, though investigators were unable to determine the exact circumstances due to the degraded state of the trace evidence. Digital forensics revealed additional evidence of Wagner's guilt in the form of internet search history from the weeks following Rachel's murder. His browsing data showed extensive research into police investigation techniques, evidence disposal methods, and news coverage of the case. He had searched for information about DNA evidence degradation, security camera blind spots in Capitol Hill, and techniques for removing forensic evidence from vehicles and clothing. The searches painted a picture of a guilty individual desperately trying to stay ahead of an investigation while monitoring police progress through local news coverage. The cumulative weight of the evidence created what prosecutors would later describe as an ironclad case against Wagner. Cell phone data, security footage, financial records, physical evidence, and digital forensics all pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. Wagner had stalked Rachel Thompson for months, used his digital surveillance capabilities to learn her routines, and then murdered her in her own home during the chaos of the early pandemic lockdown. The evidence suggested careful planning and methodical execution, followed by a sustained effort to cover his tracks and deflect suspicion away from himself and onto unknown perpetrators who would never be found. The arrest of David Wagner shattered the collective sense of safety that had defined the Ballard community for generations, leaving residents grappling with a betrayal so profound that many struggled to process the reality of what had been hidden beneath their neighborhood's familiar surface. In the days following Wagner's arrest, Nordic grounds became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with longtime customers gathering outside the shuttered coffee shop to stare at the crime scene tape and closed until further notice, signs that had replaced the warm welcome they had known for years. The conversations that unfolded on the sidewalk carried the hollow quality of funeral parlor whispers, as neighbors attempted to reconcile the man they had trusted with their children, their secrets, and their daily routines with the monster described in the charging documents. Martha Rodriguez, who had been bringing her teenage daughter Sophia to Nordic grounds every Saturday morning for the past 2 years, found herself unable to sleep after learning the details of Wagner's surveillance activities. She replayed countless interactions in her mind, searching for warning signs she might have missed, analyzing conversations that had seemed perfectly innocent at the time. Rodriguez remembered how Wagner had always seemed particularly interested in Sophia's college plans, asking detailed questions about which universities she was considering and whether she planned to live on campus or in off-campus housing. What had seemed like the caring interest of a family friend now felt like the calculated questioning of a predator gathering intelligence about a future target. The psychological impact on the community extended far beyond the regular customers who had known Wagner personally. Parents throughout Ballard began questioning their own judgment, wondering how they had failed to recognize the danger that had been operating in plain sight among them. Susan Mitchell, a single mother who had often used Nordic grounds as an impromptu childcare solution, leaving her 10-year-old son Jeremy at a corner table with homework while she ran errands, experienced panic attacks when she realized how vulnerable her child had been. The coffee shop had felt like the safest place in the neighborhood, a community living room where parents could trust that their children would be watched over by caring adults. The revelation that Wagner had been documenting and potentially targeting young customers transformed that sense of security into a source of overwhelming guilt and fear. Local business owners faced their own crisis of confidence as the investigation revealed the extent of Wagner's digital surveillance network. Rebecca Yang, who operated a small bakery 3 blocks from Nordic grounds, discovered that her teenage employees had frequently visited Wagner's coffee shop during their breaks, connecting to his Wi-Fi network and unknowingly exposing their personal communications to his surveillance system. The knowledge that Wagner had been harvesting personal information from young women throughout the neighborhood created a sense of violation that extended far beyond his direct victims. leaving business owners questioning their responsibility to protect their employees and customers from threats they had never imagined. The emotional toll was particularly severe for those who had considered Wagner a personal friend. Robert Fleming, a retired carpenter who had spent most mornings at Nordic grounds playing chess with Wagner, found himself unable to enter any coffee shop without experiencing anxiety attacks. Fleming had shared intimate details about his family, his financial struggles, and his health concerns with a man he now realized had been studying him for potential exploitation. The chess games that had provided structure and companionship during Fleming's retirement now felt like elaborate manipulation sessions where he had been unwittingly providing personal intelligence to a predator. Perhaps most devastating was the realization among community members that they had collectively failed to protect Rachel Thompson and potentially other victims through their willful blindness to Wagner's true nature. Neighborhood watch groups that had focused on external threats from transients and drug dealers had completely missed the danger operating from within their own commercial district. The coffee shop that had hosted fundraisers for local charities provided free meals during the pandemic and served as a gathering place for community organizing had been a facade concealing systematic predatory behavior that had ultimately led to murder. The search warrant executed on David Wagner's residence in the Sunset Hill neighborhood of Ballard revealed a digital archive of predatory behavior that investigators would later describe as one of the most comprehensive stalking operations they had ever encountered. FBI cybercrime specialist Agent Jennifer Walsh coordinated the seizure of multiple devices from Wagner's modest craftsman-style home, including desktop computers,
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
laptops, external hard drives, and a sophisticated photography equipment setup that had been concealed in his basement workshop. The initial analysis of the seized devices revealed thousands of images, videos, and documents that painted a disturbing picture of systematic surveillance targeting young women throughout the Seattle metropolitan area. The most shocking discovery was a custom-built computer server hidden behind false walls in Wagner's basement, equipped with multiple terabyte storage drives containing what appeared to be years of accumulated surveillance data. The server had been configured to automatically back up information from Wagner's coffee shop surveillance network, creating a comprehensive digital archive of customer activities, conversations, and personal information harvested through his Wi-Fi monitoring system. Digital forensics expert Marcus Rivera described the setup as more sophisticated than many corporate security systems, suggesting that Wagner had invested considerable time and resources into perfecting his surveillance capabilities. Among the most disturbing evidence was a collection of photographs taken with high-powered telephoto lenses from concealed positions around Seattle. The images showed dozens of young women in various states of privacy, captured as they entered and exited apartment buildings, walked to their cars, studied in coffee shops, and went about their daily routines, completely unaware that they were being documented. Rachel Thompson appeared in over 200 photographs, with images dating back to January 2020, showing her daily commute from Capitol Hill to the University of Washington campus. The photos revealed that Wagner had been following her for months, learning her routines and identifying windows of vulnerability that he would eventually exploit. The digital evidence also included audio recordings made with concealed devices that Wagner had apparently hidden throughout Nordic grounds. The recordings captured private conversations between customers, phone calls made from the coffee shop, and intimate discussions that patrons had assumed were private. Wagner had been systematically documenting the personal lives of his customers, building detailed profiles that included information about their relationships, financial situations, work schedules, and living arrangements. The recordings revealed that several young women had discussed feeling uncomfortable with Wagner's attention, but had dismissed their concerns as paranoia rather than recognizing legitimate warning signs. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Wagner's digital planning documents, encrypted files that detailed his escalating fantasies and eventual plans to assault Rachel Thompson. The documents showed a progression from passive surveillance to active planning, with detailed maps of Rachel's apartment building, notes about security vulnerabilities, and timelines for potential approaches. Wagner had conducted extensive research into Rachel's personal life, documenting her class schedule, her part-time work hours, and her social activities with the precision of a military intelligence operation. The files included photographs of her apartment building taken from multiple angles, floor plans apparently obtained through public records, and notes about the habits of her neighbors that could potentially interfere with his plans. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Wagner's connections to dark web forums, where predators shared surveillance techniques and victim identification strategies. Using sophisticated encryption software, Wagner had participated in online communities that provided instruction on stalking methodologies, evidence disposal techniques, and methods for avoiding detection during criminal activities. The forum posts, traced back to Wagner through digital fingerprinting analysis, showed his increasing confidence and boldness as he prepared to escalate from surveillance to physical assault. The digital evidence painted a picture of a methodical predator who had spent years perfecting his surveillance techniques while operating under the cover of a trusted community figure. The sophistication of his operation suggested that Rachel Thompson's murder was not an impulsive act of violence, but the culmination of a carefully planned and executed assault that had been months in the making. The digital archive contained enough evidence to potentially link Wagner to other unsolved cases involving young women, opening the possibility that Rachel's murder was not his first violent crime, but rather the latest in a series of predatory attacks that had gone undetected by law enforcement. The interrogation room at the Seattle Police Department's West Precinct had witnessed countless confessions over the decades, but Detective Lieutenant Sarah Yang had never encountered a suspect quite like David Wagner. Seated across from her at the metal table on December 8, 2023, Wagner appeared diminished, his carefully maintained facade of community respectability crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence that surrounded him like the walls of an inescapable prison. The man who had once commanded respect and admiration from an entire neighborhood now sat hunched in an orange King County Jail jumpsuit, his hands shaking slightly as he processed the reality that his double life had finally been exposed to the harsh fluorescent lighting of a criminal investigation. Yang had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying Wagner's psychological profile and developing an interrogation strategy designed to exploit the narcissistic tendencies that FBI behavioral analysts had identified in their assessment. She began the session by methodically presenting the evidence that had led to his arrest, laying out crime scene photographs, DNA analysis reports, cell phone tracking data, and digital surveillance evidence with the precision of a prosecutor building a case before a jury. Wagner's initial response was predictable denial, claiming that the evidence had been contaminated or misinterpreted, that his presence in Capitol Hill on the night of Rachel's murder was purely coincidental, that the digital surveillance equipment in his coffee shop was nothing more than standard business security measures. But as Yang continued to present evidence, Wagner's denials became increasingly desperate and contradictory. The DNA evidence was particularly devastating to his defense, as the statistical impossibility of a false match left no room for reasonable doubt about his presence at the crime scene. When confronted with the photographs recovered from his digital archive, showing months of systematic stalking and surveillance of Rachel Thompson, Wagner's carefully constructed alibi began to disintegrate. His claims of conducting inventory work at Nordic grounds were contradicted by security footage. His assertions of innocent customer relationships were undermined by evidence of predatory behavior, and his denials of violent tendencies were exposed as lies by the digital documentation of his escalating fantasies. The breakthrough came when Yang presented Wagner with the audio recordings recovered from his hidden surveillance devices, playing back conversations in which he had discussed his obsession with Rachel with disturbing intimacy. The sound of his own voice planning her assault seemed to shatter whatever psychological defenses he had maintained, and for the first time since his arrest, Wagner's composure completely collapsed. The confession that followed was halting and fragmented, delivered through tears and barely coherent whispers, as he acknowledged the terrible truth that he had been hiding from himself as much as from the world around him. Wagner's account of the night of April 15, 2020, revealed the cold calculation behind what prosecutors would later describe as a premeditated murder. He admitted to using his knowledge of Rachel's routine to time his approach to her apartment building, employing techniques he had learned from dark web forums to gain entry without triggering security systems. His original intention, he claimed, had been to assault Rachel and leave her alive. But when she fought back with unexpected ferocity, scratching his face and arms in her desperate attempt to escape, he had panicked and struck her repeatedly with a metal object he had brought for the purpose of intimidation. The confession continued with Wagner's detailed description of his efforts to cover up the crime, including his use of his vehicle to transport evidence away from the scene and his systematic destruction of digital communications that could have linked him to Rachel's murder. He described the psychological torment he had experienced in the years following the killing, living with the constant fear of discovery while maintaining the facade of a caring community member. The weight of his secret had driven him to increase his surveillance activities, as if documenting the lives of other potential victims could somehow provide him with a sense of control over the chaos he had created in his own mind. As Wagner's confession concluded, Young found herself confronting the banality of evil in its most disturbing form, realizing that the monster who had destroyed Rachel Thompson's life and shattered an entire community's sense of security was nothing more than a deeply broken individual who had chosen to inflict his psychological damage on innocent victims rather than seeking the help he desperately needed. The sentencing hearing for David Wagner took place on a grey February morning in 2024, with King County Superior Court Judge Patricia Morrison presiding over a courtroom packed with Ballard community members, University of Washington students, and Rachel Thompson's family members who had traveled from Spokane to witness the conclusion of their 4-year journey toward justice. The proceedings carried the weight of collective trauma, as an entire community attempted to process the revelation that their trusted neighbor had been responsible for one of Seattle's most heinous crimes. Wagner's guilty plea to aggravated murder in the first degree had eliminated the need for a trial, but the sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for victim impact statements that would finally give voice to the pain and betrayal that had consumed the Ballard neighborhood since his arrest. Rachel's parents, David and Susan Thompson, delivered statements that reduced the courtroom to silence, describing the devastating impact of losing their daughter to a predator who had disguised himself as a pillar of the community. Susan Thompson's voice trembled as she recounted the years of unanswered questions, the sleepless nights wondering if her daughter's killer would ever be brought to justice, and the additional trauma of learning that Rachel had been systematically stalked and surveilled before her murder. The family's statements revealed that Rachel had actually mentioned feeling uncomfortable about a creepy coffee shop owner in her final phone calls home, but had dismissed her concerns as pandemic-induced paranoia rather than recognizing legitimate warning signs that might have saved her life. Judge Morrison's sentencing decision reflected the calculated nature of Wagner's crimes and his complete violation of the trust that the community had placed in him. The life sentence without possibility of parole was accompanied by a statement acknowledging the unique horror of Wagner's betrayal, noting that his position as a beloved community figure had allowed him to operate with impunity while targeting vulnerable victims who had no reason to suspect his true nature. The judge's remarks emphasized that Wagner's surveillance network and predatory behavior represented a form of psychological terrorism that had victimized not just Rachel Thompson, but an entire community of people who had believed they were safe in his presence. The aftermath of Wagner's sentencing revealed the long-term psychological damage that his crimes had inflicted on the Ballard community. Nordic grounds remained permanently closed, its empty storefront serving as a daily reminder of the evil that had operated behind its welcoming facade. Several longtime residents reported developing trust issues that extended far beyond their interactions with local business owners, finding themselves unable to form new friendships or participate in community activities without experiencing anxiety and suspicion. The coffee shop that had once served as the neighborhood's social center had been transformed into a symbol of betrayal that many residents found impossible to overcome. Seattle Police Department's investigation into potential additional victims yielded disturbing results that suggested Wagner's crimes extended beyond Rachel Thompson's murder. cold case detectives identified at least 3 other missing persons cases involving young women who had been customers at Nordic grounds or residents of neighborhoods where Wagner's surveillance activities had been documented. While definitive links could not be established due to the deterioration of evidence over time, the investigations revealed patterns of behavior that strongly suggested Wagner had been escalating his predatory activities for years before Rachel's murder. The case also prompted significant changes in how Seattle law enforcement approaches digital surveillance crimes and community-based predators. The sophistication of Wagner's surveillance network highlighted gaps in existing cybercrime legislation and led to new protocols for investigating suspicious digital activities in commercial establishments. The Wagner case became a teaching example for law enforcement agencies nationwide, demonstrating how predators can exploit positions of community trust to identify and target victims while avoiding detection through careful manipulation of their public image. As the legal proceedings concluded and the Ballard community began the long process of healing, many residents found themselves grappling with philosophical questions about the nature of evil and the possibility of truly knowing the people around them. The Wagner case had demonstrated that even the most trusted community members could harbor dark secrets, leaving survivors to wonder whether their sense of safety and belonging could ever be fully restored. For those who continue to follow true crime cases like this one, the questions raised by Wagner's betrayal serve as a sobering reminder that predators often hide in plain sight, protected by the very trust and community bonds that make neighborhoods feel safe and welcoming.